Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be looking at behaviour, and we're going to talk about the difference between innate behaviour and learned behaviour. Now, the behaviour of an animal is described as the way which reacts and relates to stimuli and the environment. So the behaviour of an animal is the way or ways in which it reacts and relates to stimuli in the environment. And people argue whether certain things are innate, so natural part of us, or learned. So what we're going to do is consider an innate behaviour and a learned behaviour and look at how to distinguish between the two. So some examples of innate behaviour include hunting instincts, the migration of black cats, for example, or, as I've got here, suckling instinct in newborns. That's quite a tough habit to break. So we're going to use that as an example of innate behaviour and look at what defines it. Now I've got a picture over to the right of the dolphin being trained. Now, training dolphins to perform is what we would describe as a learned behaviour. Equally, domesticated behaviour in pets, or the acquisition of language and social skills, we all say that they are learned behaviours, that they are not innate. We don't have them instinctively. So we're going to use the terms and points that I've written down the right hand side here, and we're going to move them across and decide whether they are innate or learned behaviours. So let's start with the suckling instinct as our innate behaviour. Now that is, without doubt, instinctive. And because it's instinctive, we can say that it is genetically based. There are fixed action patterns involved there. A learned behaviour, like training the dolphin, that one would be based on experience. Innate behaviours, so instinctive behaviours, aren't really modified by the individual because they're instinctive, whereas learned behaviours do tend to be modified by the individual by trial and error. Because they're based on experience, if we try and fail, we learn how to cope and deal with that. Let's think about variation. For an innate behaviour, there is generally sort of low variation in the population. It's quite uniform. That behaviour is very typical amongst animals. But if you compare that with learned behaviour, there's quite high variation within the population. Everyone will learn things differently. Now, beneficial behaviours evolve through natural selection, and we think about survival and reproduction. When that happens, that's more of an instinctive, innate behaviour. Those beneficial behaviours have come about as a result of natural selection, or that's the idea. Now, if we compare that with learned behaviour, it's suggested that the capacity to learn may actually be a product of natural selection. So we're thinking more about capacity rather than those specific behaviours. So when we think about in terms of the environment, we can say that innate behaviour is largely unaffected by the environment. It's more specific to do with the actual individual. Whereas learned behaviour is much more highly affected by that environment. So I think let's just move these a little bit just to really make it a bit clearer as to which ones go with which. Here we go. So here are some key differences between innate and learned behaviour. Innate is instinctive and thus genetically based, unaffected by the environment and not modified by the individual, shows low variation in the population, and those behaviours we think have evolved through natural selection. Whereas learned behaviours tend to be based on experience, so are highly affected by the environment. Because everybody learns differently, there's likely to be high variation within that population. And clearly, through trial and error, if that behaviour results in something negative, we're likely to learn from it and modify that behaviour. So we get modification by the individual, and it's suggested that whereas innate learning, the behaviours have evolved through natural selection, as a result of natural selection, learned behaviours allow us to have capacity to learn. So we have the capacity to learn as a product of natural selection. So there's some of the key differences between innate and learned behaviour. Now, there are some quite important things to consider. I mean, to what extent is human behaviour innate or learned? Does experimentation, for example, under lab conditions, affect human responses? I mean, there was a study done looking at human facial expressions and whether they would learned or innate. But then questions would arise, could those limitations apply to studies of other species or phenomena? Or does the observer, by the act of observing, actually change the outcome of the investigation? You might ask, what other aspects of human nature could be innate, actually in nature? So morals, religious belief, skepticism, sexual attraction, mate preference. So these are things that you might question. In nature, are they actually innate? Now, there are two types of behaviour. One is non-directional and one is a directional response to a stimuli, and both of which are innate, and they're called taxis and kinesis. Now, those two I'm going to talk about in more detail in a separate video as a separate subject. So taxis and kinesis, they are directional and non-directional responses to stimuli. So we're going to look at in another video the difference between those two particular things, which is important because that comes up at Key Stage 4 Round 5. But in this video, we're just looking at the fundamental differences between innate and learned behaviour. Okay, I hope all that helps.